a tale of werewolves, alphas, and fated destinies, written by Olivia Stone. The forest path was quiet in that unsettling way that meant something terrible had happened nearby. And Sarah Moonwhisper had learned over her 2 years of wandering alone that when the birds stopped singing and the small creatures stopped rustling through the undergrowth, it meant death was close enough to taste on the wind. She'd been walking for 6 days straight, deliberately taking the longer route that skirted the very edge of the Northern Kingdom's territory, because the thought of accidentally crossing into Alpha King Caden Stormcrest's lands made her stomach twist with a combination of old pain and newer, harder anger that she'd spent 2 years trying to bury deep enough that it wouldn't consume her entirely. Her long, silver hair, which fell past her waist in waves that caught the late afternoon sunlight and made it look like she was wrapped in liquid moonlight, was tied back in a practical braid that had come loose during her travels, and her pale skin, which had always been almost luminescent with that strange silver undertone that had made other wolves uncomfortable her entire life, was smudged with dirt and marked with small scratches from brambles she'd pushed through to avoid the main roads where she might be recognized. She wore simple traveling clothes that had seen better days, a worn cloak that had once been deep blue but had faded to something closer to gray, a leather tunic that was patched in 3 places, and boots that were holding together more through sheer determination than actual structural integrity at this point. And she carried a small pack that contained her healing supplies, some dried meat and bread that wouldn't last another 2 days, and a water skin that was running dangerously low. Sarah had been heading toward the eastern valleys, where a small pack had sent word that they needed a healer skilled enough to help with a difficult pregnancy, one of the few jobs she could still get despite her reputation as the Omega who'd been publicly rejected by an Alpha King. Because apparently being deemed not good enough for royalty made some packs question whether you were good enough for them either. But she'd learned to take whatever work she could find and never stay long enough for the whispers and pitying looks to become unbearable. She'd been surviving like this for 2 years now, ever since that terrible day when Caden Stormcrest had stood before 300 witnesses during what was supposed to be their mating ceremony and declared in a voice that carried across the entire ceremony ground that she was too weak to stand beside a warrior king, too soft to be the Luna of a kingdom that was preparing for war, too unsuitable in every way that mattered to be his mate and his queen. The memory of that day still had the power to make her breath catch in her throat and her hands shake if she let herself dwell on it for too long, which was why she'd become an expert at shoving those memories down into a dark corner of her mind, where they couldn't ambush her during vulnerable moments, though they still haunted her dreams with such regularity that she'd almost gotten used to waking up with tears on her face and a hollow ache in her chest that never quite went away. The sudden flare of her healing sense hitting her awareness was like being doused with ice water, so intense and overwhelming that she actually stumbled and had to catch herself against a nearby tree. One hand pressed to her chest as she gasped at the sheer magnitude of pain and death that was radiating from somewhere not far ahead. Her life weaver gift, the rare healing power that had been passed down from both her parents who'd been renowned healers before rogues had killed them when she was 16 and left her orphaned and alone, allowed her to sense life force in living beings within about 100 yards, and right now, that sense was screaming at her that there were dozens of wolves nearby who were badly injured, some dying, some already dead, and the concentration of agony was so dense that she could actually feel it like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. She stood there for a long moment, her storm-gray eyes with their flecks of silver that seemed to glow when she used her powers wide and unfocused as she tried to process what she was sensing. Her breathing coming faster as panic started to claw its way up her throat, because this many casualties meant a major battle, and a major battle this close to the Northern Kingdom's borders meant it was almost certainly Caden's forces who were involved. Every instinct of self-preservation that she'd carefully cultivated over 2 years of survival told her to turn around and walk away, to head in the opposite direction as fast as her tired legs could carry her, because getting involved with anything related to Caden Stormcrest was a recipe for more pain and humiliation than she'd already endured. And she owed him nothing, owed his kingdom nothing, owed his warriors absolutely nothing after the way they'd all stood there and watched while he destroyed her in front of everyone. But even as she tried to force her feet to move away from the source of all that suffering, even as she told herself firmly that this wasn't her problem and she had no obligation to help wolves who served the king who'd rejected her so cruelly, her healer's heart was already betraying her with the way it twisted at the thought of all those injured warriors lying on a battlefield somewhere nearby without enough help. She remembered the oath she'd taken when her parents had finished training her in the healing arts, the solemn promise she'd made before the moon goddess herself that she would turn away from no suffering if she had the power to ease it. And she remembered her mother's voice, warm and loving and so achingly missed, telling her that a true healer's gift wasn't just in the magic they wielded, but in the choice to use that magic even when it was difficult, even when it was dangerous, even when it would cost them something precious. Sarah stood there in the middle of that too quiet forest path, torn between the self-protective instinct to run and the deeper, older instinct to heal. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, and her silver braid falling over one shoulder as she bowed her head and tried to make a decision that felt impossible. She could feel individual life forces now as her awareness expanded, could feel a young warrior who couldn't be more than 18 years old bleeding out from a severed artery in his leg, could feel an older wolf with what had to be a collapsed lung struggling to breathe, could feel so many others who would die in the next hour if they didn't get help. And she knew with absolute certainty that the Northern Kingdom's healers wouldn't be enough to save them all, because this kind of carnage required more skilled hands than any single pack would have readily available. The rational part of her mind was screaming that she should leave, that these warriors had probably been there 2 years ago when she'd been humiliated, that they'd probably whispered about her afterwards and agreed with their king that she wasn't suitable, that she didn't owe them her skills or her energy or her compassion. But the healer part of her, the part that her parents had carefully nurtured, and that even 2 years of wandering alone and being treated like damaged goods hadn't managed to kill, couldn't walk away from people who were dying when she had the power to save at least some of them. She made the decision before she'd fully realized she was making it, her feet already carrying her toward the source of all that pain and death, her hands reaching up to check that her healing supplies were secure in her pack. And she found herself moving faster as individual life forces started winking out of her awareness like candles being snuffed one by one. Each death a small stab of guilt that she hadn't gotten there faster. The forest opened up suddenly into a massive clearing that had clearly been the site of a brutal ambush, and Sarah stopped at the edge of the tree line, her breath catching in her throat as she took in the scope of the carnage that was spread out before her, like some nightmare vision of what war actually looked like when you stripped away all the glory and honor that warriors like to talk about. There were bodies everywhere, both wolves in their animal forms and shifters who died in their human shapes, blood soaking into the churned-up earth until the ground was more red than brown. The acrid smell of death and smoke and fear so thick in the air that she could taste it, and scattered among the dead were the wounded, some crying out for help, some lying silent and still in ways that suggested they were too far gone to even make noise anymore. She recognized the white armor of the elite guard immediately. Those 12 legendary warriors who served as the Alpha King's personal unit and who were said to be the finest fighters in all the territories. And her heart sank as she realized that if the elite guard had been involved in this battle, then Caden himself had almost certainly been here, leading from the front the way he always did, because he was too honorable and too stubborn to send his warriors into danger that he wouldn't face himself. The kingdom's healers were scattered throughout the battlefield, working frantically to save who they could. But Sarah could see, even from a distance, that they were overwhelmed and underskilled for injuries this severe, and she watched one elderly healer woman shake her head sadly and move away from a warrior who was clearly dying, moving on to someone she might actually be able to save, because in a situation like this, you had to make terrible choices about who got help first. Sarah's legs were moving before her brain had fully caught up with what she was doing, carrying her out of the safety of the tree line and onto the battlefield itself. And she went directly to the young warrior the healer had just abandoned, a boy who couldn't be more than 18 with a face that still had the softness of youth despite the pain etched across his features. And she knelt beside him in the blood-soaked dirt, without even thinking about the fact that she was ruining her only set of traveling clothes. His injuries were severe enough that most healers would have written him off as too far gone to save. A massive gash across his abdomen that had torn through muscle and probably nicked his intestines. Blood loss that had left him pale and shocky, and she could feel his life force flickering like a candle in a strong wind. But Sarah had always been stubborn about who lived and who died, had always refused to accept that just because someone was badly injured meant they were beyond saving. She placed her hands over his wound and reached for her life weaver power, that deep well of energy that lived somewhere in the center of her being and that allowed her to sense and manipulate life force itself. And she poured healing energy into him with a precision that came from years of training and 2 years of desperate practice on wolves who had no one else to turn to. The tissue began to knit together under her hands, blood vessels sealing themselves, torn muscle reweaving strand by strand, and she could feel him stabilizing, his life force growing stronger and steadier. And when his eyes fluttered open and focused on her face with confusion and gratitude, she was already moving on to the next patient because there were so many others who needed help, and she was burning through her own energy reserves at a rate that she knew was dangerous but couldn't seem to stop. She moved from warrior to warrior like some silver-haired avenging angel, her storm-gray eyes intense and focused as she assessed each injury and determined what she could fix and how much energy it would cost her. And she could feel the other healers stopping to watch her in amazement, because the wounds she was healing were ones they couldn't touch. The level of skill she was displaying was far beyond what most healers ever achieved in a lifetime of practice. She saved a female warrior who'd been disemboweled by what had to have been a massive claw strike. She saved a male warrior whose skull had been fractured badly enough that bone fragments were pressing into his brain. She saved an older wolf who'd taken a sword through his lung and was drowning in his own blood, and with each healing she felt herself growing weaker and more drained. But she couldn't stop, couldn't walk away, couldn't let any of them die if she had even a chance of saving them. It was only when she felt a hand on her shoulder, gentle but insistent, that she looked up from the warrior she'd been working on to find one of the elite guard standing over her, his face a mixture of shock and something that might have been recognition. And he said in a voice rough with emotion and exhaustion that she needed to come with him right now because General Marcus was asking for her specifically. She followed him through the carnage in a daze, her hands still tingling with residual healing energy, and her body starting to shake from how much power she'd already expended. and she barely registered the other elite guards they passed, who all stopped and stared at her with expressions that ranged from disbelief to something that looked almost like hope. General Marcus Ironfang was lying near what had once been a command tent, but was now just a collapsed pile of torn canvas and broken poles. And even from 10 feet away, Sarah could see that his wounds were mortal. The kind of injuries that even a life weaver couldn't heal, because there was just too much damage and too much blood loss and not enough time. She knelt beside him anyway, her healer's instinct refusing to just let him die without at least trying, and she placed her hands over the terrible wound in his abdomen where something had torn him open from ribs to hip. But even as she started to channel energy into him, she knew it was futile because his life force was already fading too fast for her to catch and hold. His eyes opened, cloudy with pain and approaching death, and it took him a moment to focus on her face, but when he did, she saw recognition flare in his expression, along with something that looked like relief and regret, all mixed together. "Sarah Moonwhisper," he rasped out, each word clearly costing him tremendous effort, his hand reaching up to grasp her wrist with surprising strength for someone so close to death. "You came. I didn't think. After everything, I didn't think you'd come." She wanted to tell him that she hadn't come for any of them specifically, that she'd just come because she was a healer and couldn't walk away from suffering. But something in his expression stopped the words in her throat, and she found herself just nodding silently as she continued trying to heal wounds that were beyond even her considerable skill to fix. "The king!" Marcus gasped out, his grip on her wrist tightening almost painfully as he tried to pull her closer, blood bubbling at the corners of his mouth in a way that meant his lungs were filling and he had maybe minutes left at best. "You have to, the king. You have to save the king. Please, I know we don't deserve it. I know what we did to you, what he did to you, but please, please save him." The words hit her like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs and making her healing falter for just a moment as the implications sank in. Because if Marcus was using his last breaths to beg her to save Caden, then that meant Caden was badly injured or worse, and she felt something cold and terrible unfurl in her chest at the thought. Marcus died before she could ask him anything else, his hand going slack around her wrist, and his eyes glazing over with that particular emptiness that meant his soul had left his body. And Sarah sat there for a moment just staring at him as her mind tried to process what he'd said and what it meant, and whether she could actually face seeing Caden Stormcrest again after 2 years of deliberately avoiding even thinking about him too directly. The elite guard who'd brought her to Marcus was still standing there, and when she looked up at him with a question in her eyes, he just nodded toward the center of the battlefield, where she could see a cluster of white-armored warriors all standing in a tight circle around something, and she knew with a certainty that bypassed all logic and reason that Caden was at the center of that protective formation. She stood on shaking legs, her body protesting the amount of energy she'd already spent, and the amount she knew she was about to need, and she made her way toward the elite guards on autopilot. Her healer's sense reaching out ahead of her and finding a life force that was so faint she almost missed it entirely. A flickering ember that was barely clinging to existence. The 12 elite guards parted silently when they saw her approaching, their faces all showing the same expression of desperate hope mixed with uncertainty. And Sarah understood in that moment that they all recognized her. All remembered her from 2 years ago when she'd been paraded in front of the court as Caden's chosen mate and then publicly humiliated, and they had no idea if she would help or if she would let their king die as revenge for what he'd done to her. She stepped through their protective circle and stopped dead, every thought in her head going completely silent as she took in the sight of Alpha King Caden Stormcrest lying motionless on a torn and blood-soaked cloak, his body so covered in blood that it took her a moment to even identify all the separate wounds that had been inflicted on him. His silver hair, which had always been one of the few physical traits they'd shared and which had made other wolves whisper about how perfectly matched they'd seemed before the rejection, was matted with blood and dirt and spread out around his head like a dark halo, and his face, which she'd once thought was the most handsome face she'd ever seen, was gray pale with the color of death already settling into his features. The wounds were catastrophic, even by battlefield standards, a deep gash across his chest that had cut through muscle and exposed bone, claw marks down his side that had torn through vital organs, a sword wound through his abdomen that had probably severed major blood vessels, and a leg that was bent at an unnatural angle that suggested multiple fractures, and beneath him was a pool of blood so large that she couldn't understand how there could possibly be any blood left in his body at all. She stood there frozen, unable to move or speak, or even breathe properly, as her mind tried to reconcile the powerful, arrogant Alpha King who'd rejected her so cruelly with this broken, bleeding thing that looked more like a corpse than a living wolf. And she felt a complicated tangle of emotions surge through her that she couldn't even begin to name or understand. The pack healer, an elderly woman with tears streaming down her weathered face, looked up at Sarah with an expression of utter hopelessness and defeat. "He's gone," she said, her voice cracking on the words as if saying them out loud made them more real and more terrible. "His heart stopped 2 minutes ago, maybe 3. I tried everything I know, but there was just too much damage and too much blood loss, and even a life weaver couldn't bring back someone who's already crossed over into death." The words should have brought Sarah some kind of satisfaction or vindication, or at least a sense of cosmic justice being served. Because the man who'd called her too weak and too soft and not good enough was lying dead at her feet, proving that all his strength and all his power hadn't been enough to save him in the end. But instead, all she felt was a crushing emptiness and a grief so profound, it made her want to scream. This wasn't supposed to happen like this, wasn't supposed to end with him dead on a battlefield before she'd ever gotten the chance to prove to him that she was stronger than he'd thought, before she'd ever gotten the closure she needed, before she'd ever gotten to look him in the eyes and tell him that he'd been wrong about her, and that she'd survived despite his rejection, and that she didn't need him or his approval or his kingdom. She should walk away, should turn around and leave this place and let the Northern Kingdom deal with their dead king and find a new ruler and move on with their lives while she moved on with hers. Because she didn't owe Caden Stormcrest anything except maybe a lifetime of resentment for what he'd done to her. And saving him now wouldn't change the past, or erase the pain, or make any of the last 2 years any less terrible. But even as she thought these things, even as she tried to force her feet to move away from his corpse, her healer's heart was breaking at the waste of it all, at the thought of someone so vital and powerful and alive being reduced to nothing but cooling meat and congealing blood. And she found herself remembering not the king who'd rejected her, but the man she'd fallen in love with before everything had gone so horribly wrong. The man who'd courted her with surprising gentleness and had made her laugh, and had looked at her sometimes like she was the most precious thing in all the territories. Her hands were shaking as she knelt beside his body in the blood-soaked dirt, her knees sinking into the mud that was more blood than earth at this point, and she reached out with trembling fingers to place her palms on his chest over his heart, feeling the terrible stillness where there should have been a heartbeat. feeling the coldness of his skin that meant his body temperature was already starting to drop. "You don't get to die, Caden Stormcrest," she heard herself whisper, her voice rough with emotions she didn't want to examine too closely and couldn't have named if she tried. "You don't get to leave me with that rejection as our last moment together. You don't get to make me watch you die when I could have stood beside you and protected you and been there if you'd just let me. You don't get to prove them all right about me being too weak by dying before I could prove them wrong." The words were spilling out of her now. 2 years of accumulated pain and anger and hurt pouring out in a desperate stream that she couldn't seem to stop. "You called me weak, but I'm strong enough to save you, even after everything you did to me. I'm strong enough to give you back your life, even though you took mine away. I'm strong enough to be the bigger person here, even though you never gave me the chance to be anything at all. So wake up, damn you. Wake up and look at me and see what you threw away. See what you were too blind and too stubborn and too stupid to recognize." She reached deep into her life weaver power, past the normal reserves she used for regular healing, past the safety limits her parents had drilled into her about never draining herself too dangerously low, down to the very core of her life force itself, where the raw, primal energy that made her who and what she was lived like a banked fire waiting to be unleashed. She'd never gone this deep before, had never pushed past those carefully maintained boundaries, because her parents had warned her that using this level of power could kill her if she wasn't careful. But looking at Caden's dead body and thinking about all the things that would never be resolved between them and all the words that would never be said, she found that she didn't care about the danger, because letting him stay dead felt worse than any risk to herself. The power came flooding up through her like a tidal wave of pure life energy, raw and primal and agonizing in its intensity, as it tore through her body and poured out through her hands into Caden's chest, and she could feel it burning through her like liquid fire, consuming her from the inside out as she gave and gave and gave, until there was nothing left to give except her own life force. She didn't know how long she knelt there, pouring everything she had and everything she was into his corpse, seconds or minutes or hours all blending together into one endless moment of agony and determination. But suddenly she felt it, felt the faintest flutter of response deep in his chest, where his heart should be beating, felt a tiny spark of life force that hadn't been there before begin to grow and strengthen under her hands. His heart gave one weak, stuttering beat, then another, then fell into a rhythm that was ragged and uneven, but unmistakably alive, and his chest expanded with a gasping, desperate inhale as his body remembered how to breathe. And then his eyes, those silver blue eyes that had haunted her dreams for 2 years, snapped open suddenly and locked onto her face with an intensity that made the rest of the world fall away into insignificance. She saw recognition flare in those eyes immediately, saw disbelief and wonder and confusion all chasing each other across his expression, and she heard him whisper her name, just Sarah, in a voice that was hoarse and wondering and full of emotions she couldn't begin to interpret. And in that moment, the mate bond that had been suppressed and dormant since his rejection suddenly roared back to life between them with such devastating force that it felt like being struck by lightning. The bond had never actually broken despite the rejection, she realized with a shock that made her gasp out loud. It had just been buried and suppressed and pushed down into some corner of both their souls, where it had been waiting all this time for a chance to resurface. And now it was flooding back with 2 years of accumulated longing and connection and need all hitting them both simultaneously. Sarah felt the world tilting sideways as her vision started to go dark around the edges, felt her body finally giving out after pouring so much of her own life force into bringing Caden back from death, felt herself starting to collapse forward across his chest as consciousness began to slip away from her like water through her fingers. And the last thing she registered before everything went black was Caden's arms coming up to try to catch her despite his own terrible injuries, his voice calling her name with desperate urgency, and the mate bond between them pulsing with a golden warmth that felt like coming home after a lifetime of being lost. Sarah woke to the sensation of silk sheets against her skin and the warmth of a fire crackling somewhere nearby. Sensations that were so foreign to her after 2 years of sleeping on the ground or in rough in-beds that for a moment she thought she must still be unconscious and dreaming, her mind conjuring up fantasies of comfort and safety that her reality had long since ceased to provide. Her eyelids felt heavy as lead as she forced them open, squinting against the soft golden light that filtered through what she slowly realized were actual glass windows with real curtains, not the crude shutters or canvas flaps she'd become accustomed to during her wandering. And as her vision gradually came into focus, she found herself staring up at an intricately carved ceiling painted with scenes of wolves running beneath a full moon, the kind of artistic luxury that spoke of wealth and permanence and everything she'd left behind when Caden had cast her aside. The room itself was enormous by her current standards, easily 4 times the size of most of the rooms she'd stayed in over the past 2 years, with thick furs spread across a floor made of polished wood that gleamed in the firelight, tapestries hanging on the walls that depicted what looked like the history of the Northern Kingdom, and furniture that was so well crafted and expensive-looking that she felt almost afraid to touch any of it, as if her presence alone might somehow damage these beautiful things that existed in a world she no longer belonged to. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it, as pain lanced through her body and made her gasp, every muscle screaming in protest, as if she'd been beaten thoroughly and left to recover without proper healing. Which she supposed wasn't far from the truth, since using her life-weaver powers to the extent she had on the battlefield had essentially torn her body apart from the inside and left her as damaged as any of the warriors she'd saved. Her head was pounding with a headache so severe that it made her vision swim and her stomach lurch with nausea. Her hands were shaking so badly that she could barely flex her fingers, and she could feel a bone-deep exhaustion that went beyond simple tiredness into something more fundamental, as if she'd burned through not just her energy reserves, but parts of her actual life force that would take months or maybe even years to fully replenish. The memories came flooding back in a disorienting rush that made her wish she'd stayed unconscious a little longer. Images of the battlefield and the blood and the bodies flashing through her mind with vivid clarity. And then the memory of Caden lying dead on that torn cloak, his silver hair matted with blood and his face gray-pale with death. And the desperate, foolish decision she'd made to bring him back, despite everything he'd done to her. Despite all the pain and humiliation and loneliness he'd caused her. She remembered his eyes snapping open and locking onto her face with that devastating intensity, remembered the mate bond slamming back into existence between them with such force that it had felt like being torn apart and put back together simultaneously. And she remembered starting to collapse as her body finally gave out after she'd poured so much of herself into his healing that there was almost nothing left. The realization of where she must be hit her like a physical blow that made her breath catch in her throat and her heart start to race with something that was equal parts panic and anger. Because if she was in a room this luxurious, in a building this well appointed, then she could only be in one place. And that place was the absolute last location in all the territories where she wanted to find herself after 2 years of carefully avoiding it. She was in the Northern Kingdom's royal palace, in what was almost certainly a guest chamber, or possibly even one of the royal family's personal rooms, which meant that Caden had brought her here after she'd collapsed, had probably carried her here himself, or ordered his elite guards to do so, and the thought of being back in this place where she'd once been so happy, and then so thoroughly destroyed, made her want to scream or cry, or possibly both at the same time. The door opened before she could gather enough strength to actually attempt getting out of the bed and fleeing, and Sarah found herself tensing automatically as a figure stepped into the room, her body preparing for a confrontation that she wasn't sure she had the energy or the emotional fortitude to handle right now. But it wasn't Caden who entered. It was an elderly female wolf with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing the simple but well-made clothing of a palace healer, and she was carrying a tray with what looked like food and medicinal tea that sent fragrant steam curling up into the air. "Oh good, you're awake," the healer said with a warm smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes and made Sarah's defensive tension ease slightly despite her best efforts to maintain her guard. "We were starting to worry. You've been unconscious for 3 full days now, and while we could sense that you were just sleeping off the exhaustion rather than in any actual danger, it's still concerning when someone doesn't wake up for that long, especially someone who gave as much of themselves as you did on that battlefield." 3 days, Sarah's mind repeated with a shock that made her feel dizzy and disoriented all over again. She'd been unconscious for 3 entire days, while her body tried to recover from the catastrophic drain on her life force, which meant that Caden had been awake and healing for 3 days, while she'd been vulnerable and unconscious in his palace. The healer set the tray down on a small table beside the bed and began checking Sarah over with gentle, practiced hands, examining her eyes and checking her pulse, and making small humming sounds that suggested she was cataloging Sarah's condition and finding it about what she'd expected. "My name is Elena Brightwater," the elderly woman said conversationally as she worked, her tone friendly and matter-of-fact, in a way that made it hard for Sarah to maintain her defensive hostility. "I'm the head healer here at the palace, and I have to say, I've been absolutely fascinated by the reports of what you did on that battlefield. The level of skill you displayed, and the number of lives you saved despite working alone and without any support or supplies beyond what you were carrying." Elena moved to the tray and poured a cup of tea that smelled like chamomile and willow bark and several other herbs that Sarah recognized as being good for pain and inflammation, bringing it over and holding it out with an expectant look that made it clear she wasn't going to accept any refusal. "You brought 37 warriors back from the brink of death, healed injuries that our healers had already written off as too severe to fix, and then you brought our king back from actual death itself, which is something I've only read about in the oldest healing texts, and honestly wasn't sure was even possible outside of legends and fairy tales." Sarah took the cup with shaking hands that she couldn't quite steady no matter how hard she tried, wrapping her fingers around the warm ceramic and drawing some small comfort from the heat that seeped into her cold skin. And she took a cautious sip that revealed the tea was exactly as medicinal and slightly bitter as she'd expected, but also strangely soothing. "I need to leave," she heard herself say, her voice coming out rougher and weaker than she'd intended, sounding like she'd been screaming for hours, even though she'd been unconscious the entire time. "I need to get my things and leave before. I just need to leave." Elena's expression shifted into something that looked like understanding, mixed with a kind of gentle firmness that reminded Sarah painfully of her own mother, and the elderly healer sat down in a chair beside the bed with the air of someone settling in for a long conversation. "You've been unconscious for 3 days, and you nearly died saving our king. You're not going anywhere until you're properly recovered, and that's not coming from the king. That's coming from me as a healer, who knows that if you try to use your powers again in your current state, you'll kill yourself." The words were delivered in such a matter-of-fact, non-negotiable tone that Sarah found herself wanting to argue purely on principle. But the truth was that she could feel how depleted she was, could sense that her life force was barely a fraction of what it should be. And she knew that Elena was right about the danger of pushing herself too far too fast. Before Sarah could formulate a response that wouldn't sound completely ungrateful or unreasonable, the door opened again, and this time it was Caden who entered. And Sarah felt her entire body go rigid with tension, and something that might have been fear or anger, or possibly just the overwhelming urge to throw something at his head. He looked better than he had any right to look after being dead on a battlefield 3 days ago. His silver hair clean and tied, back from his face. His powerful frame dressed in simple training clothes rather than formal wear. But she could see the bandages wrapped around his torso beneath his shirt, and the careful way he moved that suggested his injuries were still healing and causing him considerable pain. His silver blue eyes found her immediately and locked onto her face with an intensity that made her breath catch and made the mate bond between them pulse with a warmth that she desperately wanted to ignore, but couldn't quite manage to. And she saw relief and concern and something that looked like longing chase each other across his handsome features in rapid succession. "Sarah," he said, and just the sound of her name in his voice after 2 years of not hearing it, 2 years of convincing herself that she'd moved past him and didn't care anymore, was enough to make her chest tighten with emotions she refused to acknowledge or examine too closely. "You've been unconscious for 3 days, Caden continued, moving further into the room but stopping a careful distance away from the bed, as if he sensed that coming too close would spook her, or possibly provoke her into doing something violent. "You nearly died saving me. You gave so much of your own life force that the healers weren't sure you'd ever wake up again. And I've been sitting beside this bed for most of those 3 days, terrified that I'd gotten you killed by being stupid enough to get myself mortally wounded in the first place." There was something raw and honest in his voice that made Sarah want to believe him, want to accept that he was genuinely concerned about her well-being and grateful for what she'd done. But 2 years of learning to protect herself from further pain made her lock down those softer impulses and replace them with the hard shell of anger and self-preservation that had kept her functional during her wandering. "That's not your decision to make," she said, her voice coming out sharper and colder than the tea in her hands, each word deliberately chosen to create distance and maintain boundaries that she needed to survive this encounter. "You gave up any say in my life or my choices or what I do with my powers 2 years ago when you stood in front of 300 witnesses and declared that I was too weak and too soft and too fundamentally unsuitable to stand beside you as your mate and your Luna." She saw him flinch as if she'd struck him physically, saw pain flash across his face, and knew that her words had hit their intended target. But she felt no satisfaction in causing him pain, only a hollow emptiness that made her wish she'd never woken up at all. "I need to leave," Sarah repeated, her hands tightening around the teacup until her knuckles went white and she could feel the ceramic creaking slightly under the pressure. "I don't know why you brought me here instead of just leaving me on the battlefield where I collapsed. But I don't want to be here. I don't want to be in this palace where everyone knows that I was rejected, where everyone watched you humiliate me and agreed that I wasn't good enough, and I especially don't want to be anywhere near you." Caden's expression shifted into something that looked like a combination of determination and barely suppressed emotion, and he moved slightly closer despite her obvious hostility, his silver blue eyes never leaving her face. "I know you have every right to hate me," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't quite name and wasn't sure she wanted to understand. "I know that what I did to you was unforgivable, that I destroyed you in front of everyone who mattered and then let you walk away to deal with the consequences alone while I stayed safe in my palace and my kingdom." "I don't hate you," Sarah heard herself interrupt, the words spilling out before she could stop them, driven by some need to make him understand that what she felt was so much more complicated than simple hatred. "I don't feel anything for you anymore. I spent 2 years learning how to not feel anything for you. Learning how to shut down every emotion and every memory and every foolish hope I'd ever had about us so that I could survive, and I got very good at it." She set the teacup down on the bedside table with enough force that some of the tea sloshed over the rim, and she finally met his eyes directly for the first time since he'd entered the room, letting him see the cold emptiness in her storm-gray gaze. "I saved you because I'm a healer, and you were dying, that's all. There's nothing more to it than that. It wasn't about you specifically, or about our past, or about the mate bond that you rejected. It was just me doing what healers do, and now that you're alive and I'm recovered enough to travel, I'm leaving, and you're never going to see me again." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, even as she spoke it, because they both knew that the mate bond was still there between them, still pulsing with that golden warmth that meant their souls were connected in ways that couldn't be severed by simple rejection or 2 years of separation. But she needed him to believe that she felt nothing, needed him to let her go without a fight, because she couldn't stay here and be reminded every single day of everything she'd lost. Caden was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable as he studied her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she forced herself to hold his gaze, refusing to be the first one to break eye contact. "You collapsed across my chest after you brought me back from death," he finally said, his voice soft but carrying clearly in the quiet room. "And the mate bond snapped back into place between us with enough force that everyone standing nearby could feel the energy of it, could see it glowing golden in the air around us." He took another step closer, close enough now that she could smell his scent, that combination of pine and winter air, and something uniquely him that had haunted her dreams for 2 years. "Don't tell me you felt nothing when that happened. Don't tell me you don't feel it right now, pulling at you, and telling you that I'm yours and you're mine. Because I can see it in your eyes every time you look at me. I can feel it through the bond that's connecting us, whether you want to acknowledge it or not." Sarah felt something crack inside her chest, some carefully constructed wall that she'd built around her heart, starting to crumble under the weight of his words and his presence, and the undeniable truth of the mate bond that she'd been trying so hard to ignore. "The mate bond means nothing," she said, but her voice wavered slightly on the words, and she knew he heard it, knew he could sense her defenses weakening. "You rejected that bond in front of everyone. You said I wasn't strong enough, or suitable enough, or good enough to be your Luna. You chose your crown and your kingdom and your war over me, and that bond doesn't give you ownership of me or any say in my choices." "I was wrong," Caden said, the words simple and direct, and somehow more devastating than any elaborate apology could have been. "I was 24 years old and terrified of losing you to enemies who'd specifically threatened to torture and kill you if I made you my Luna. And every advisor I trusted told me that the only way to keep you safe was to push you away, to make everyone believe that you meant nothing to me so that you wouldn't be targeted. He ran a hand through his silver hair in a gesture of frustration that she remembered from before, from when they'd been courting, and he was trying to explain some complicated political situation that was bothering him. My generals showed me intelligence reports about rogue armies planning to kidnap you during our mating ceremony. Showed me detailed plans they'd intercepted about how they were going to hurt you to get to me. And they convinced me that the kindest thing I could do was reject you publicly so that everyone would know you weren't important to me, weren't someone who could be used as leverage against the kingdom. The explanation hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and making her head spin with the implications. Because if what he was saying was true, then everything she'd believed about the rejection for the past 2 years was based on a lie, based on him trying to protect her in the worst possible way. "You didn't even give me a choice," Sarah said, her voice breaking slightly on the words, as 2 years of accumulated pain started forcing its way past her defenses, despite her best efforts to keep it contained. "You decided I was too weak to protect myself, too fragile to handle the danger, too incapable of making my own decisions about what risks I was willing to take. And you proved their point by casting me aside like I was nothing." The tears were threatening to spill over now, burning hot behind her eyes and making her vision blur. And she blinked rapidly to try to force them back because she refused to cry in front of him, refused to show him just how deeply he'd broken her. "Do you have any idea what the last 2 years have been like? Wandering alone with no pack and no home and no one, being treated like damaged goods by every pack I tried to offer my services to because everyone knew that an Alpha King had rejected me, and they all assumed there must be something fundamentally wrong with me to deserve that?" Her hands were shaking again, harder than before, and she clasped them together in her lap to try to still them, her nails digging into her palms hard enough to leave marks. "I convinced myself that you were right about me, that I really was too weak and too soft, and not good enough for anything except healing minor injuries for packs that barely tolerated my presence, and I spent every single day trying to make myself smaller and quieter and less of everything I used to be because I thought that's what I deserved." Caden's expression was anguished now, raw pain written across every line of his face, and she saw his hands clench into fists at his sides as if he was physically restraining himself from reaching for her. "I know," he said, his voice rough with emotion that sounded genuine enough to make her chest ache. "I know I failed you in every possible way. I know I was a coward who let fear and bad advice convince me to hurt you worse than any enemy could have. I know that I destroyed the best thing in my life because I was too stupid and too proud to just trust that you were strong enough to face danger beside me." He moved closer still, close enough now that she could have reached out and touched him if she'd wanted to, though she kept her hands firmly clasped in her lap. "I've looked for you for months, ever since I finally realized what a catastrophic mistake I'd made. I had scouts searching every territory and every neutral zone trying to find you so I could beg your forgiveness and try to make things right. But you were always one step ahead of me, always moving before my people could catch up to you." The revelation that he'd been searching for her, that the wandering and the constant movement that she'd thought was her choice had actually been partially driven by his pursuit, made something twist uncomfortably in her stomach. "And then I was dying on that battlefield," Caden continued, his silver blue eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "And my last thought before everything went dark was that I'd never get to tell you I was sorry, that you'd never know that I've loved you every single day since I pushed you away, that I'd spend eternity regretting the choice I made and knowing that you probably thought I'd never cared about you at all. The words, loved you, hit her like lightning, making her breath catch and her heart stutter in her chest. Because in all their time together before the rejection, he'd never actually said. Those words out loud had shown her affection and desire and respect, but had never quite crossed that line into declaring actual love. "You don't get to say that to me now," Sarah said, her voice shaking with anger and pain, and something that might have been desperate hope that she was trying very hard to strangle before it could take root. "You don't get to die and come back from death and suddenly decide that you love me and expect that to fix everything. Expect me to just forgive you and accept the mate bond and go back to being the naive, trusting woman who believed that an alpha king could actually want someone like me." She finally looked away from him, unable to maintain eye contact, while her emotions were threatening to overwhelm her defenses completely, and she stared down at her hands in her lap, noticing distantly that they were still shaking and wondering if they would ever be steady again. "I gave you everything I had on that battlefield," she whispered, the words so quiet that he had to lean closer to hear them. "I poured my own life force into you. I brought you back from actual death. I nearly killed myself to save you, and do you know why I did it?" She looked up at him again, letting him see the raw pain and confusion in her storm-gray eyes. "Because even after everything you did to me, even after 2 years of being alone and broken and convinced that I was worthless, I still couldn't let you die. I still couldn't walk away from you lying there dead on that battlefield. And I hate myself for being that weak, for caring that much about someone who cared so little about me that he could destroy me in front of everyone and then just move on with his life." Caden looked like she was killing him with her words, his face pale and his eyes bright with what might have been tears. And when he spoke, his voice was barely more than a hoarse whisper. "I never moved on. I never stopped caring. I never spent a single day not regretting what I did to you and wishing I could take it back. But I convinced myself that you were better off without me, that you'd find another pack and another mate and build a life that didn't include the king who'd hurt you so badly." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside the room, raised voices and the sound of running feet. And then one of the elite guards burst through the door without knocking, his face flushed and his expression urgent in a way that made Sarah's healing sense immediately flare to life in case someone was injured. "Your Majesty," the guard said, breathing hard as if he'd been running, his eyes flicking briefly to Sarah before focusing back on Caden with obvious concern. "The scouts have returned from the northern border, and they're reporting that the rogue army is regrouping. They apparently retreated after the last battle, but they weren't defeated, and intelligence suggests they're planning another attack on the palace itself within the next few days." The words hung in the air, like a death sentence, and Sarah saw Caden's entire demeanor shift from vulnerable and emotional to cold and commanding in an instant, his shoulders straightening and his expression hardening into the mask of an alpha king who had a kingdom to protect and couldn't afford to be distracted by personal matters. "How many warriors do we have combat ready?" Caden asked, his voice clipped and professional, all traces of the emotional vulnerability he'd been showing just moments before, completely locked away behind duty and responsibility. The guard's expression was grim as he delivered his report, confirming what Sarah's healing sense had already told her about the state of the Northern Kingdom's forces. "Less than half our full strength, Your Majesty. Many of the warriors are still recovering from the last battle, and while Sarah Moonwhisper saved many lives, They're not yet fit for combat, and our reserves were already stretched thin before this." Caden's jaw clenched, and Sarah could see him running through calculations and strategies, could almost see the weight of responsibility settling back onto his shoulders like a physical burden. And she felt something shift inside her chest as she realized that he was still weak from his own injuries, was still not fully recovered despite her healing, and would be leading warriors into battle again while nowhere near his full strength. "Get the council together," Caden ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument or discussion. "I want full tactical assessments, and I want to know every possible defensive position we have, and send word to our allied packs that we need reinforcements immediately." The guard saluted and turned to leave, but before he could exit the room, Sarah heard herself speaking, her voice cutting through the military efficiency with words that she hadn't consciously decided to say, but that came from some deep, instinctive place that refused to be silenced. "I'll stay," she said, the words dropping into the tense silence like stones into still water, and she saw both Caden and the guard turn to stare at her with identical expressions of shock. "I'll stay and help with the wounded when the battle comes. You'll need every healer you can get if the rogue army is as large as your scout is suggesting. And despite everything between us, I can't walk away knowing that warriors are going to die who I might be able to save." She forced herself to meet Caden's eyes, forced herself to keep her voice steady even though inside she was screaming at herself for making this choice, for committing to staying in this place that held so much pain. "But this doesn't change anything between us. This doesn't mean I forgive you or accept the mate bond or want anything from you beyond professional cooperation during a crisis. I'm staying as a healer who's needed, nothing more." Caden's expression was unreadable as he studied her face, and for a long moment the silence stretched between them taut and fragile as spider silk, and then he nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement that acknowledged her terms, even as she could see in his eyes that he was filing away her decision to stay and finding hope in it despite her words. "Thank you," he said simply, the two words carrying more weight than any elaborate speech, and then he was striding from the room with the guard following behind him, leaving Sarah alone with Elena Brightwater, who had been watching the entire exchange with fascinated interest. "Well," Elena said into the silence that Caden left behind, her tone dry and knowing in a way that made Sarah want to either laugh or cry, or possibly both. "That was certainly illuminating, and if you're planning to stay and help during the coming battle, we should probably work on getting your strength back as quickly as possible, because from what the scouts are saying, you're going to need every bit of power you can muster." Sarah nodded numbly, her mind already racing ahead to what was coming, to the battle that would inevitably bring more death and more wounded and more impossible choices about who lived and who died. And she found herself wondering what kind of cosmic joke the moon goddess was playing by bringing her back to this place, back to this man, back to this situation where her healing skills were desperately needed, but where her heart was still too broken to fully function. She picked up the medicinal tea that had gone lukewarm while they were talking and drained it in several long swallows, the bitter taste grounding her in the present moment and reminding her that she'd survived worse than this, had survived rejection and isolation and 2 years of wandering alone, and she could survive whatever was coming next, even if it killed her in the process. The mate bond pulsed between her and Caden, even though he was no longer in the room, a constant golden thread connecting them across distance, and despite all the hurt and anger and unresolved pain. And Sarah closed her eyes and tried to block it out, tried to rebuild the walls around her heart that his presence had started to crack, because she knew with absolute certainty that if she let those walls fall completely, if she let herself feel everything she'd been suppressing for 2 years, It would destroy her just as thoroughly as his rejection had, and this time, she might not survive the aftermath. The dawn came too quickly, painting the sky in shades of blood red and gold that seemed like an omen of the violence to come, and Sarah stood at the window of her guest chamber, watching the palace grounds transform into a hive of military activity as warriors gathered and weapons were distributed and defensive positions were established with the grim efficiency of wolves who knew they were about to fight for their lives. She'd spent the last 3 days working in the healing ward alongside Elena and the other palace healers, rebuilding her strength through careful meditation and restorative teas, while also teaching them advanced techniques that might save crucial minutes when the wounded started pouring in. And she'd deliberately avoided any private interaction with Caden beyond brief, professional exchanges during council meetings where her expertise as a healer was needed to assess how many warriors were actually combat-ready. The mate bond had been a constant presence, humming beneath her skin like a second heartbeat, pulling at her awareness every time Caden was nearby, and making it nearly impossible to maintain the emotional distance she needed to protect herself. But she'd gotten remarkably good at ignoring uncomfortable truths over the past 2 years, and she applied those same skills to pretending that the bond didn't exist and didn't matter. The rogue army had been spotted at first light gathering in the valley below the palace, and the scouts reported that their numbers were even larger than feared, easily 3 times the size of the Northern Kingdom's forces, even if every single warrior who could hold a weapon was counted, which meant this battle was going to be less about victory and more about survival. Sarah had set up a field hospital in the Great Hall, transforming the space where formal dinners and celebrations were usually held into rows of beds and stations stocked with bandages and medicinal supplies. And she'd positioned her most skilled healers at strategic points where they could triage incoming wounded and direct the worst cases to her for treatment with her Lifeweaver powers. She was wearing practical clothes borrowed from the palace stores, leather pants and a sturdy tunic that wouldn't restrict her movement, and she'd braided her long silver hair into a crown around her head to keep it out of her way while she worked. Though she'd caught Caden staring at her during the last council meeting with an expression that made her chest ache with emotions she refused to acknowledge. The warning bells began to ring just as the sun fully cleared the horizon, their urgent clanging echoing across the palace grounds and signaling that the rogue army was beginning their assault, and Sarah felt her healing sense immediately expand outward as she prepared to track injuries across the battlefield and prioritize which warriors would need her attention most urgently. She could hear the sounds of combat starting at the outer walls, the clash of weapons and the snarls of wolves in their animal forms, and the screams of the injured and dying, and she forced herself to focus on the task ahead, rather than thinking about the fact that Caden was out there somewhere leading the defense, despite still not being at full strength from his injuries. The first wave of wounded arrived within minutes, warriors being carried or dragging themselves into the Great Hall with injuries ranging from minor cuts that just needed cleaning and bandaging to catastrophic wounds that required immediate intervention, and Sarah threw herself into the work with the single-minded focus that had kept her sane during her 2 years of wandering, letting the familiar rhythm of assess, heal, move on override every other thought and emotion. She saved a young female warrior who'd taken a sword through her shoulder that had nicked the major artery, using her Lifeweaver powers to seal the blood vessel and knit the torn muscle back together, while the warrior gritted her teeth against the pain and thanked her with tears streaming down her face. She saved an older male wolf whose leg had been nearly severed by what looked like a massive claw strike, the bone shattered and the flesh hanging by threads of tissue, and she poured energy into encouraging the bone to knit and the muscle to reweave itself while Elena worked beside her cleaning the wound and applying poultices that would prevent infection. She moved from patient to patient in a blur of focused intensity, her hands steady despite the exhaustion that was already starting to creep into her muscles. her storm-gray eyes glowing silver with the power she was channeling. And she could feel her energy reserves depleting, but she couldn't stop, couldn't slow down. Not when every minute she spent resting was a minute that someone else might be bleeding out. Hours passed in a haze of blood and pain, and the desperate effort to save lives faster than the battle could take them. And Sarah was just finishing with a warrior who'd been disemboweled by a rogue's claws when one of the elite guards burst into the great hall. His white armor splattered with blood, and his expression urgent in a way that made her heart drop into her stomach with cold dread. "The king needs you on the battlefield," the guard said, his voice rough with exhaustion and what might have been fear, his silver eyes finding hers with an intensity that brooked no argument. "Captain Riker, the rogue leader, he's fighting the king directly, and His Majesty is being overwhelmed. He's still weak from his previous injuries, and Riker is, we need you there now." The words hit her like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs and making her hands shake as she processed what he was saying, because Caden was out there fighting an enemy who was stronger and more rested while still recovering from wounds that had killed him just days ago. And if she didn't go to him, he was going to die again, and this time she might not be able to bring him back. Every logical, self-preserving instinct told her to refuse, to stay in the relative safety of the great hall where she was needed and where she wouldn't have to watch Caden die, wouldn't have to make the choice about whether to save him again, wouldn't have to confront the fact that despite everything he'd done to her, she still couldn't bear the thought of a world without him in it. But even as these thoughts raced through her mind, even as she tried to convince herself that his death wasn't her responsibility and she owed him nothing, her feet were already carrying her toward the door, and her hands were already checking her supplies, and she heard herself telling Elena to handle the incoming wounded because she had to go stop an Alpha King from doing something heroically stupid. The battlefield was chaos incarnate when she emerged from the palace. Warriors fighting in both human and wolf forms across the churned and blood-soaked ground. Bodies of both rogues and kingdom wolves scattered everywhere like broken dolls. And the air was thick with the sounds of combat and death, and the acrid smell of fear and rage that made her want to gag. Her healing sense led her unerringly toward the center of the fighting, where she could feel Caden's life force blazing like a bonfire, despite the weakness that still lingered from his previous near death. And when she finally spotted him through the press of bodies, she felt her breath catch at the sight of him facing off against a massive wolf that had to be Captain Riker. The rogue leader was enormous even by Alpha standards, his dark fur matted and scarred from countless battles, his yellow eyes gleaming with malicious intelligence, and he was clearly winning the fight against Caden, who was moving with the skill of a born warrior, but whose strength was flagging in ways that were obvious to anyone who knew how to look. Sarah watched in horror as Riker landed a devastating blow that sent Caden sprawling, watched as the rogue leader closed in for what was clearly meant to be a killing strike, and something inside her snapped with an almost audible crack that felt like chains breaking and walls crumbling, and every careful defense she'd built over 2 years shattering into dust. She didn't remember making the conscious decision to move, didn't remember running across the battlefield or pushing through warriors who tried to stop her. But suddenly, she was there between Caden and Riker, her small frame positioned protectively over the Alpha King who was struggling to rise, and she felt her life weaver power surge up through her with an intensity she'd never experienced before, as pure protective instinct overrode every other consideration. "No," she heard herself say, the single word carrying across the battlefield with shocking force, and she threw her hands forward and felt energy explode outward in a wave that caught Riker mid-lunge and sent him flying backward to crash into the ground 15 feet away. The rogue leader shifted to human form as he rose, his scarred face twisted with rage and contempt, and he laughed with genuine amusement at the sight of her standing there trying to protect Caden. "The soft little healer thinks she can fight," Riker said, his voice carrying that particular brand of cruelty that came from someone who enjoyed causing pain. "The weak Omega that even her own mate rejected, standing between me and my prize, like she matters, like she's anything more than a liability that the great Alpha King was smart enough to cast aside." The words should have hurt, should have cut her the way similar words had been cutting her for 2 years. But instead, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, some fundamental understanding clicking into place as she realized with sudden, blazing clarity that she'd been wrong about everything. "I'm not weak," she said, her voice steady and clear despite the chaos raging around them, her storm-gray eyes meeting Riker's yellow ones without flinching. "I'm not soft or unsuitable or any of the things I've been told I am. I'm strong enough to save lives, which is harder than taking them. I'm strong enough to heal when others would destroy. I'm strong enough to stand here and protect the wolf I love, even after he broke my heart." She felt Caden's sharp intake of breath behind her, felt his shock through the mate bond at her casual admission of love. But she didn't look back at him because her focus was entirely on the threat in front of her. "And I'm definitely strong enough to stop you from hurting anyone else ever again." What happened next was something Sarah would later struggle to explain coherently, because her Lifeweaver powers manifested in ways she'd never imagined possible, her consciousness expanding to encompass every living being on the battlefield as she felt their life forces like bright flames in her awareness. She reached out with her gift, not to heal, but to redistribute, pulling energy from the rogue warriors who were attacking her kingdom's defenders and channeling it into the Northern Kingdom's wolves, watching in fierce satisfaction as her warriors suddenly surged with renewed strength, while their enemies faltered and weakened. She created a network of healing that touched every injured kingdom wolf simultaneously, knitting wounds and stopping bleeding and clearing toxins from systems, transforming the tide of battle through sheer force of compassionate will, channeled into devastating effectiveness. Riker tried to attack her directly, shifting back to wolf form and lunging with jaws aimed at her throat. But Caden was there suddenly, despite his injuries, intercepting the strike and engaging the rogue leader in combat that was brutal and vicious, and absolutely equal now that Sarah was feeding him energy through the mate bond that connected them. She watched them fight with her hands still raised, and power still flowing through her like a river that had finally found its proper course. And she realized that this was what partnership was supposed to look like. Not one protecting the other by pushing them away, but both fighting together with complementary strengths that made them unstoppable as a unit. Caden was the sword, and she was the shield. He dealt death to their enemies while she preserved life for their allies. And together, they were exactly what a kingdom at war needed. Exactly what they should have been 2 years ago, if fear and bad advice and misguided attempts at protection hadn't gotten in the way of what could have been. The battle turned decisively in their favor as the rogue army began to realize they were facing not just warriors, but a healer powerful enough to turn her gift into a weapon. And when Caden finally delivered the killing blow to Riker that ended the rogue leader's life, the remaining enemy forces broke and fled in scattered disarray that spoke of total defeat. Sarah felt her power release all at once as the threat ended, felt herself swaying with exhaustion that went bone deep and made her knees buckle. But this time, when she started to collapse, it was Caden who caught her. His strong arms wrapping around her and pulling her against his chest as they both sank to the ground together amidst the carnage and the victory. "You stayed," he said, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion and wonder, his silver hair falling forward to mix with hers as he held her like she was something infinitely precious that he was terrified of losing again. "You stayed, and you fought beside me, and you called me the wolf you love, even after everything I did to you, even after I hurt you so badly." Sarah found herself laughing weakly, the sound coming out slightly hysterical, because apparently near-death experiences and massive power expenditure made her emotional walls crumble completely. "I'm an idiot," she said, her hands clutching at his shirt as if he was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become unmoored. "I'm a complete idiot because I never stopped loving you, even when I hated you. Even when I spent 2 years trying to convince myself that I'd moved on and didn't care. And I almost let you die again, because I was too proud and too hurt to admit that I can't imagine a world without you in it." Caden pulled back just enough to frame her face with his hands, his silver blue eyes searching hers with desperate intensity, and she could feel the mate bond between them blazing gold and warm and absolutely undeniable. "I don't deserve you," he said, the words carrying the weight of absolute conviction mixed with devastating hope. "I don't deserve your forgiveness or your love or your presence after what I did to you, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the second chance you're giving me by being here, by fighting beside me, by admitting that you still love me despite having every reason not to." She saw tears tracking through the dirt and blood on his face, and realized that the mighty Alpha King was crying, was letting her see him completely vulnerable and broken open by emotion, and something in her chest cracked wide open at the sight. "You were wrong about me," Sarah said, her own tears falling freely now as 2 years of suppressed pain finally found release. "But I was wrong too. I was wrong to let your rejection define me. Wrong to believe that being cast aside by you meant I was worthless. Wrong to make myself smaller and less than I was because I thought that's what I deserved, and I'm done being wrong about myself." She took a shaking breath, gathering courage from somewhere deep inside, where her strength had been waiting all along for her to acknowledge it. "I'm a life weaver powerful enough to bring people back from death. I'm a healer skilled enough to turn the tide of battles. I'm strong enough to stand beside an Alpha King as an equal partner. And any mate who can't see that and celebrate that and trust me to use that strength in my own way doesn't deserve to have me." She saw something like joy and relief and overwhelming love flash across Caden's face. And when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I see it now," he said, his thumbs wiping away her tears with infinite gentleness. "I see your strength and your power and your absolute magnificence, and I will never make the mistake of trying to protect you by pushing you away again, because I understand now that real protection comes from standing together, from trusting each other to be strong in our own ways, from building something as partners where both of us are valued equally. I accept the mate bond," Sarah heard herself say, the words coming out steady and sure despite everything, driven by a certainty that had nothing to do with fate or destiny and everything to do with conscious choice. "Not because the moon goddess declared it, or because you're an Alpha King, or because of anything except that I choose you. I choose us. I choose the future we can build together if we do it right this time, as true equals who trust each other's strength." She saw Caden's breath catch, saw overwhelming emotion flood his eyes, and then he was kissing her with desperate tenderness, pouring 2 years of regret and longing and love into the contact, and the mate bond flared between them so brightly that warriors still conscious on the battlefield later swore they saw golden light emanating from where the Alpha King and his Luna were wrapped around each other. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard and glowing with the bond's energy, Sarah tilted her head to expose her neck in the traditional gesture of acceptance. "Mark me," she said softly, holding his gaze. "Claim me as your mate and your Luna and your equal partner. But know that I'm claiming you too, because this bond goes both ways, and I won't settle for anything less than true partnership." Caden's marking was gentle despite the passion behind it, his teeth sinking into the junction of her neck and shoulder with reverent care, and Sarah felt the bond settle into place with a rightness that made her entire body sing. But she didn't stop there because she'd meant what she said about equality. She pulled him down and marked him in return, her smaller teeth finding the same spot on his neck and claiming him as thoroughly as he'd claimed her. And she felt his shock and then his fierce joy through the bond, because Omega's marking their alpha mates was rare and powerful, and spoke of a partnership that transcended traditional hierarchy. "You're mine," she whispered against his skin, feeling the bond complete itself between them in ways that were deeper and more profound than any mere marking could convey. "Just as much as I'm yours, we're equals in this, equals in everything, and if you ever try to protect me by pushing me away again, I will make you regret it in ways your imagination cannot compass." The laugh that burst out of him was surprised and genuine and full of so much love that she felt it echo through the bond between them, and when he pulled back to look at her, his smile was radiant enough to make her forget about the battlefield and the blood and the exhaustion that was threatening to pull her under. "I wouldn't dare," he said, his voice warm with affection and respect and promise. "My fierce Luna who brings kings back from death and turns the tide of wars. My equal partner who is strong enough to stand beside me through anything. My mate who chose me despite having every reason to walk away. I will spend every day of our lives honoring your strength and celebrating your power and thanking the moon goddess that you gave me another chance." The elite guards had formed a protective circle around them at some point during their conversation, their white armor blood-splattered, but their faces showing satisfaction and approval, and what looked like genuine happiness at seeing their king finally claim his true mate. And Sarah realized with a start that the entire battlefield had essentially stopped to watch the marking ceremony that was unfolding in the midst of all the carnage and death. The weeks that followed were filled with healing and rebuilding, and learning how to navigate a relationship that was fundamentally different from what they'd tried to build 2 years ago, because this time they approached each other as equals who respected each other's strengths and trusted each other's judgment, rather than one trying to protect the other through control. Sarah established herself as Luna, not through traditional displays of social grace and political maneuvering, but through the undeniable proof of her power that she demonstrated on the battlefield. And the kingdom's wolves learned quickly that their new Luna was not someone to be underestimated or dismissed, despite her appearance or her healing focus. She reformed the Palace Healing Ward into a proper academy where life weavers and other gifted healers could train without judgment. She sat on the War Council and contributed strategy that accounted for both minimizing casualties and maximizing the effectiveness of their forces, and she stood beside Caden in all things as a partner whose voice carried equal weight to his own. The formal mating ceremony was held 3 months after the battle, under a full moon with representatives from every allied pack in attendance, and Sarah wore a gown of silver silk that made her long silver hair look like it was woven from moonlight itself, while Caden stood beside her in formal armor that had been specially crafted to incorporate silver designs that matched her coloring. When they exchanged vows before the moon goddess and all witnesses, they spoke not of traditional obedience or submission, but of partnership and equality and mutual respect. And when they sealed the bond with a kiss that made the watching crowd erupt in cheers, Sarah felt like she was finally exactly where she was meant to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do, with exactly who she was meant to be with. The years that followed were not without challenges, because ruling a kingdom was never easy, and there were always new threats and new problems that needed solving. But they faced everything together with complementary strengths that made them formidable as a unit. And Sarah discovered that being Luna of the Northern Kingdom as an equal partner to the Alpha King was far more fulfilling than anything she could have imagined during her 2 years of lonely wandering. The moment that perhaps meant the most came 5 years after the battle, when a young Omega arrived at the palace seeking an audience with the Luna, her eyes red from crying and her posture defeated in ways that Sarah recognized with painful familiarity. The girl had been rejected by an alpha who'd claimed she was too weak and too emotional and too unsuitable to be his mate. And she'd come to the Luna who everyone knew had also been rejected, hoping for understanding or advice, or maybe just someone who would listen without judgment. Sarah took the girl's hands in hers and looked into her tear-stained face with compassion born of hard-won experience, and she told her story without embellishment or omission, the whole painful truth of rejection and wandering and nearly letting the man she loved die rather than risk being hurt again, and she watched as hope began to kindle in the young Omega's eyes. "Being rejected doesn't mean you're weak," Sarah said, the words carrying the weight of truth that could only come from someone who'd lived through the pain and come out stronger on the other side. "Sometimes it means you're too strong for someone who can't recognize real strength when they see it, and the right mate won't just tolerate your power. They'll celebrate it and trust you to use it in your own way." She pulled the young Omega up to the window where they could see Caden in the training yard below, working with young warriors and demonstrating techniques with the patience and skill that made him a beloved leader, his silver hair gleaming in the sunlight. "That man rejected me in front of 300 witnesses and told me I wasn't suitable to be his Luna?" Sarah said softly, feeling the mate bond pulse warm and constant between them, even across distance. "And he was wrong about my strength, and wrong about what I was capable of, and wrong to think that protecting me meant pushing me away. But we were both given a second chance to get it right, to build something based on equality and trust and mutual respect, rather than one person trying to control or protect the other." She turned back to the young Omega and smiled with genuine warmth. "Your rejection might feel like the end of everything right now, but it might actually be the moon goddess saving you from something that was wrong so she can lead you to something that's right. And until that happens, you need to remember that your worth doesn't come from whether some alpha claims you. It comes from who you are and what you can do and the strength that lives inside you, whether anyone else recognizes it or not." The young Omega left with tears in her eyes, but with her shoulders back and her head high, and Sarah watched her go with satisfaction, knowing that she'd perhaps helped another wolf avoid the years of pain and self-doubt that she'd endured. And when Caden came to find her later that evening, she was standing at their balcony, watching the sun set over their kingdom in shades of gold and crimson. He wrapped his arms around her from behind and rested his chin on top of her head, and they stood like that in comfortable silence for a long moment before he spoke. "I saw you with the young Omega today," he said softly, his breath stirring her silver hair. You gave her hope when she'd lost all of it. You showed her that rejection isn't the end of the story. And I was reminded again of how lucky I am that you gave me a second chance, despite having every reason not to. Sarah turned in his arms so she could look up at his face, seeing the love and respect and unwavering devotion in his silver blue eyes. We gave each other a second chance, she corrected gently, reaching up to touch his cheek. You learned to trust my strength, and I learned to value myself regardless of whether others could see my worth. And we built something together that's stronger than what we tried to build before, because it's based on truth and equality and conscious choice, rather than just fate and destiny. The Alpha King, who bled out after a battle, and the Omega he'd rejected who arrived and brought him back from death? Caden said, a slight smile playing around his lips. It sounds like something from a legend or a fairy tale, but we lived it and survived it and came out the other side stronger. Sarah smiled back, feeling the mate bond sing between them with contentment and love and absolute certainty. We didn't just survive it, she said, pulling him down for a kiss that was soft and sweet and full of promise. We transformed it into something beautiful. We proved that real strength comes in many forms and that true love is always a choice, the hardest and best choice we can make. And we built a kingdom where every kind of strength is honored and valued and given room to flourish. They stood together on their balcony as the sun disappeared below the horizon and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Two wolves with matching silver hair and a bond that had survived rejection and death, and 2 years of separation to become something unbreakable. And Sarah thought about how far she'd come from the broken, wandering healer who'd stumbled onto a battlefield and made the choice to save a life rather than walk away from suffering. She'd learned that compassion was not weakness, but the hardest form of strength. That healing was not passive, but required courage and determination that matched any warrior's, and that choosing to love someone after they'd hurt you was not foolishness, but bravery of the highest order. And these were lessons she would carry forward into all the years to come as Luna of the Northern Kingdom, as equal partner to an Alpha King who'd finally learned to value strength in all its forms, as a woman who'd been rejected and broken and had rebuilt herself into something magnificent, not despite the pain, but because of it. The moon goddess worked in mysterious ways, leading them through darkness and rejection and near death to bring them to this moment of perfect partnership. And Sarah sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for the journey that had been painful but necessary, for the growth that had come from suffering, and for the love that had survived everything thrown at it to emerge stronger and truer than anything fate alone could have created. The story of the Luna who'd brought her Alpha King back from death would be told and retold in their kingdom for generations. A legend that reminded all wolves that strength came in many forms, and that choosing compassion in a cruel world was the bravest act of all, and young Omegas who felt weak or unsuitable or not good enough would hear that story and understand that their differences were not flaws, but gifts waiting to be recognized. That rejection was not the end, but potentially the beginning of something better. And that true love required not just fate and destiny, but conscious choice and mutual respect, and the courage to build something together as equals. And Sarah and Caden would rule their kingdom together for many years, facing every challenge as partners, celebrating every victory as equals, and proving every single day that when two wolves chose each other freely and completely, when they trusted each other's strength and valued each other's gifts, they could create something that transcended what either could have built alone, something beautiful and powerful and absolutely unbreakable that would stand as testament to the transformative power of love, freely given and consciously chosen. If you enjoyed this story of Sarah and Caden, of rejection and redemption, of death and resurrection, of learning that true strength comes in many forms and that real love is always a choice, please let me know what you thought in the comments below, because I love hearing which moments resonated with you and which characters captured your heart. Did you feel the pain of Sarah's rejection and the hope of her second chance? Did you appreciate Caden's journey from making a terrible mistake to earning his mate's forgiveness through changed actions rather than just words? What did you think of the message that compassion and healing are forms of strength equal to any warrior's prowess? Your thoughts and feedback help me understand what kind of stories resonate most deeply and inspire me to create more content that speaks to your hearts. Please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future werewolf romance tales featuring powerful alphas, strong omegas, rejected mates who find their true paths, and epic love stories that prove the moon goddess rewards those brave enough to choose love even after being hurt. Hit the notification bell to be alerted when new stories are uploaded, and share this tale with anyone who needs to be reminded that being rejected doesn't define your worth, that your differences might actually be your greatest strengths, and that sometimes the love we almost lose becomes the love that saves us in the end. Thank you for reading, and I'll see you in the next story.